I'm Mike Sprague. I'm the director of the Polar Initiative, and it's very good to have you all here with us today. I want to thank everybody online who's also watching. Today's program follows in a series of efforts we've tried here at the Polar Initiative and at the Woodrow Wilson Center to elevate Arctic research and the challenges, opportunities, but also the realities of research in the North. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but really it's this nexus between science, research, and policy that we search to tease out as an overlapping Venn diagram that seems like there should be data-informed policymaking in whatever region, on whatever issue. But since we're focused on the Arctic, we look at programs like this as yet one more service to try to inform, but also help influence the policies that need to be carried out. So today's program is entitled Finland's Chairmanship of the Arctic Council, Exploring Common Solutions in Arctic Meteorology. I first want to thank my associate, Jack Durkee, in the back for, as always, pulling these programs together. Thank you, Jack. And to John Tyler and his team for not just the technology setups, but also we're streaming across the globe to many, many people in many nations. So we welcome them, but without John's good efforts, we would not be able to do that. And to Brody Ladd, who's part of the Polar Initiative program, for putting this all together. Many of you in the audience have helped to conceive of this idea. I want to thank Ina Peltonen from the Embassy, who has been a good friend and colleague at all hours with emails and cell phone calls and making sure that we're on track. Also, special thank you to Finland's ambassador to the United States, Ms. Kirsti Kauppi. Ambassador, thank you very much for being a good friend, not just of the Wilson Center in the United States, but to the Arctic as well. Thank you. And the ambassador will host a reception this evening at 5:30 at the Embassy, and that's open to everyone here. Also, special thank you to my colleague, a senior fellow at the Polar Initiative and the Environmental Change and Security Program, Sherry Goodman. Sherry will serve as a front row commentator after one of the panels. But Sherry conceived of the idea of working with the Embassy and also thinking about ways in which we can bring Arctic research to the issue of Arctic policy. So Sherry, thank you as well. A few more notes before we begin. Today starts a month of the Arctic, and it's fitting, for at least us here at the Wilson Center, our month of the Arctic is from May 29th until June 29th, not known as an Arctic month, but for us it is. We have a series of 7 or 8 programs happening. It's very fitting that the first of this effort starts with celebration of Finland's leadership of the Council, but also with this program today. So a little bit about this month. Just a few of the programs, the rest will be on our web. On June 11th, we will host the Royal Norwegian Embassy and Arctic Frontiers to focus on space technology for a smart and resilient Arctic. On June 20th, how fitting that a cell phone goes off as we're talking about space technology. That's okay. On June 20th, we will host Mr. Inutek Holm Olsen, Minister Plenipotentiary and Head of Representation for Greenland at the Danish Embassy to talk about Greenland's future. On the 29th of June, we will host the U.S. National Guard's Arctic Interest Council, adjutant generals from across the northern part of the U.S., talking about not only their interest in the Arctic, but their capacities, capabilities, and their vision for the Arctic as well. So again, it's fitting that we start here today. I mentioned before that the Wilson Center looks to research to inform policy and decision-making. And that is why we worked with the Finnish Embassy to tease out at least one of their themes that focused on the power and the need for more research. And what better than this topic today? I will also share with you that last week I was with 16 Fulbright fellows comprising the second cohort of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. We were in Ottawa and then went up to Iqaluit, Baffin Island. And the 4 themes of the Finnish chairmanship: environmental protection, connectivity, meteorology cooperation, and education. We could not have picked better scholars to address those issues. They weren't prepared that way because of the chairmanship, but they simply compelled these scholars to focus on those 4 areas when they look at resilient communities and sustainable communities and economic development in the future. So they quickly got a pulse of the Arctic, and I will tell you, Madam Ambassador, that these areas are, I know, special to Finland, but special to the scholars of the North as well. Today's outline will be as follows. After my closing remarks, we'll close here in a moment. We'll have a brief presentation, and then we will divide into 2 panels. Panel 1 will look at the state of Arctic meteorology, and Panel 2 will look at solutions for the future of Arctic meteorology, chaired by Dr. John Farrell, the Executive Director of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. So without further delay, it's an honor to have him here with us today, but would you please welcome to the podium the Chair of the Senior Arctic Officials of the Arctic Council, Ambassador Aleksi Harkonen. Ambassador.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Mike, for this brief and to-the-point presentation. I will try to be as brief and punctual myself. But I would like to start by thanking the Woodrow Wilson Center and its Polar Initiative for organizing this workshop on meteorological cooperation in the Arctic. It's a very important theme for us, and we hope for you as well. And it's important to continue exploring common solutions. That is the slogan for of the Finnish chairmanship. Common solutions also in Arctic meteorological work, following the most successful Arctic Meteorology Summit held 2 months ago in Levi, northern Finland. Promoting meteorological cooperation is one of the priorities of the Finnish chairmanship of the Arctic Council. The others are protecting the environment, improving connectivity, and ensuring equal educational opportunities for all Arctic inhabitants. The chairmanship slogan, looking for common solutions or exploring common solutions, emphasizes two aspects of Arctic cooperation. This cooperation should be result-oriented and it should be inclusive. It seems that meteorological cooperation fulfills these criteria. Observation, research and services are part and parcel in the efforts to look for common solutions to issues that we are all facing in the rapidly changing Arctic circumstances. National institutes and the WMO have been providing much needed expertise to delegations and working groups of the Arctic Council already for a long time. But last year, the Arctic Council recognized the obvious need for even closer cooperation by inviting the WMO to become an observer of the Council. That invitation was a small investment from the side of the Arctic Council, and it is already paying enormous dividends. The Arctic Council is grateful for the very positive response of the WMO and the National Meteorological Institutes for the increasing attention devoted to Arctic issues. The Arctic Council is taking a close look at the relationship between regional and global developments, especially climate change and globalization. It seems that a limited regional approach will not be sufficient when we are facing the challenges of the future. Still, of course, action on a regional scale is necessary because of the rapid changes that will affect humans and nature more quickly in the Arctic than elsewhere. And it must be based on the best available knowledge and take fully into account the needs of Arctic indigenous peoples and other Arctic inhabitants. There are great challenges in Arctic cooperation. One is the generally negative trend in international relations. The international situation has been tense for some years, and it's not showing any signs of getting any easier. Syria, Iran, Ukraine, and other issues continue to dominate the divisive international agenda. Still, Finland's experience of the first year of Arctic chairmanship is that the cool heads have prevailed in Arctic cooperation. All member states of the Arctic Council want to continue constructive cooperation. This was confirmed in the statement that they gave on the occasion of the Council's 20th anniversary 2 years ago, and it was also confirmed last week in the meeting that was held in Ilulissat, Greenland, on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the Ilulissat Declaration. That declaration was given 10 years ago by the 5 Arctic coastal states, including the US. I would like to go back to Arctic Meteorological Cooperation and to the significance of the Arctic Meteorological Week that we had 2 months ago in northern Finland. It was a combined effort by the Finnish Meteorological Institute, the WMO, other national weather institutes, and the Finnish chairmanship of the Arctic Council. We had impressive presentations on meteorological cooperation and also on connectivity, which was the other main theme of the senior Arctic officials meeting. It seems that these 2 areas are closely connected. What, among other things, is connecting them is the advance of satellite technology, which is rapidly advancing. It's providing opportunities which previously did not exist. So, in meteorological cooperation, we could say that the sky is not the limit anymore. During that week, contacts between the participants of the Arctic Council meeting and the Meteorological Week were maximized. And in general, these contacts have really been multiplied in the recent times. And meteorological cooperation is now firmly on the agenda of Arctic cooperation. One of the senior Arctic officials confessed after the meeting in March that he now understood the need of meteorological expertise in Arctic cooperation. Earlier, he said he had thought that meteorological cooperation was just an extra decoration of the Finnish chairmanship. So, ladies and gentlemen, in order to be successful, the Arctic Council must have a future-oriented agenda. That is why the Arctic states and the permanent participants representing Arctic indigenous peoples are preparing a strategic plan for the Council. It is being drafted in several meetings, and it will be presented to the ministerial meeting, which will be held in May next year. One of the fundamental questions for the Arctic Council is the involvement of non-Arctic states with interests in the region and perhaps with plans to use the opening of maritime transport routes and Arctic energy, mineral resources, and other resources. The recently published Arctic policy document of the People's Republic of China points to the kind of questions that need to be addressed when the Arctic becomes more accessible. A year ago, Finland received the Arctic Council chairmanship from the United States in a very smooth transition. 2 weeks ago, the presidents of Finland and Iceland agreed that we should work for a similar smooth transition next year when Iceland takes over the Arctic chairmanship from Finland. But Finland has 1 more year to go. We have plans for some political level meetings, but in general we are quite happy about the participation of all Arctic states in this cooperation and the progress made in many areas, perhaps most notably in meteorological cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for setting the context for our work today and our discussions today perfectly. I would now like to invite the panelists for the first part of the program to join me on the stage, and I will introduce you one at a time once we're up here. Okay? Please join me. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. So the first panel will be a series of presentations, followed by a few questions moderated from me. But I would then also invite, as I said before, Sherry Goodman for her comments and thoughts, and then open it up to the audience as well. We tried to make these as engaging as possible, so please, if you have questions, we'll have microphones on either side of the room, and please feel free to ask a question or two as we move forward throughout the afternoon. So, to my left, joining me here on the dais is Professor Juhani Damski, the Director General of the Finnish Meteorological Institute. To his immediate left is Dr. Arne Snorresson, Director General of the Icelandic Meteorological Institute. And to his left is Mr. Carvin Scott, Alaska Region National Weather Service. It's nice to have a fellow Alaskan on the panel. But I'm a big fan of Finland and Iceland as well, so everything will be fine. We've asked these gentlemen to join us today because, as the chairmanship has noted and as the ambassador has outlined, we simply feel that this area not only is in need of understanding, capacity building, effort, continued international cooperation, but here in Washington, D.C., it's important for those policymakers, especially those who allocate resource and try to better align effort, not just in our nation, but with nations across the world, to better understand the concept of the role of meteorological work in the Arctic and what capacities we all have to leverage this expertise, especially in the changing climate that we're all experiencing across the globe. So I want to thank the three of you for joining me on the first part of this discussion, especially since it's entitled The State of Arctic Meteorology. Professor, may I ask you to start the presentation?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we have a... Thank you, Jack.
Should I go to the podium or from here?
Wherever you're most comfortable. Podium?
To the podium. Maybe I go to the podium.
Sure.
Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, it's such a pleasure to be here. You know, everything is weather dependent, everything. You can't imagine anything that wouldn't be weather dependent. So therefore, whatever you are doing, you need to take weather into account. This is the fact. And whenever we are talking about something that is taking or happening over the Arctic areas, this is even more so. In the Arctic areas, you couldn't do anything without understanding the weather. As Ambassador Harkonen just mentioned, we had a meeting in Lapland, Finland, northern Finland, 2 months ago, where I was able to give a presentation at the Arctic Council for the senior officers there. And I recall that one of the representatives of the indigenous nations represented in the Arctic Council said that weather is the boss, and I think that that was very nicely put. In my slide here, you see a photo from the northern Finland, Lapland. We have been using this phrase quite often here in the during the time that we have been the chairman of the Arctic Council. I mean Finland, and during the time that we have been dealing with the Arctic Meteorological Cooperation in terms of the Arctic Council. And we often say that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. And for example, last March, I know that here in Washington you had a very nice representation of that fact that it's a law of the nature that the Arctic sometimes shows us the strength of the nature, and you had a lot of snow here in the Washington. Let me see. Yes. One part of the work that we do as a community in the world meteorological scene, which is often also referred to the World Meteorological Organization, that is the UN organization for dealing things together in terms of when it comes to the meteorology, is the WMO. I mean, the cooperation is there, the fact that that connects all of us. And it is very important to understand that we have to sustain these connections. Observations is the point that starts all the things that we do. It's like a starting point of our value chain. And this means that whatever we do, we have to do the measurements today. You can't go back to the yesterday and do the measurements. So they are like something that go rotten very quickly when it comes to the weather forecasting, but then again, they are very much needed in terms of research. And that's another thing that is very important here, and something to underline. It's the fact that everything is driven by research, science, and then is very much based on the fact that we need observations. And on Arctic areas, we don't have all the observations that we would need. Therefore, we would have to do cooperation in all possible levels. When it comes to the decision making, for example, you may have a decision maker that is a captain of a ship or captain of a vessel that needs to make a decision about the how to navigate in the stormy weathers and so on. But there is also other types of decision makers, like somebody who is in need to make investment for an icebreaker or some sort of a vessel that can be used in the Arctic areas or wherever. And that's also a decision that needs to be made also based on the fact that he understands or she understands what kind of weather there is when this vessel is to be operated. And finally, there is also political decision makers. And that's not something that I do envy too much, because there are very big decisions that the political decision makers need to do, and it's especially true in the Arctic areas. So we have to make cooperation in all possible levels when it comes to the making of the observations of the Arctic areas, scientific collaboration, and also collaboration in terms of developing different types of services that people need in the area, or those people need that would like to, for example, invest to the area. One of our primary goals from the beginning was to get WMO, World Meteorological Organization, and the Arctic Council more close together, so that they could do things in a sustained way and establish a collaboration that would last, say, forever. Because whatever we do, whenever we establish, for example, observational capacities in the Arctic areas, we have to be able to sustain them in the future as well. I can give you an example. FMI, the Finnish Meteorological Institute, the one that I come from, has been around for 180 years. This was our 180-year anniversary this year. So this long we have made observations about the atmosphere, about the conditions of the weather in Finland. And we have to see this at least as much to the future as well. So this is something that needs to have a long-term devotion to do these things. And it has been something that, well, quite clearly so, that also inside of the Arctic Council, they have noticed the same thing. So getting these two parties together hasn't been too hard for us. And it's quite clear that we have been doing this collaboration in terms of, for example, World Meteorological Organization for quite some time already. And the Arctic always has been not the part where we have put our priorities so far, but this is exactly the time when we have been able to do so. Here are a couple of examples that we have done already before, and also in in the framework of the World Meteorological Organization, and which are very nicely connected with this chairmanship period and also in the future. One of them is the Year of Polar Prediction, where we try to enhance our possibilities and capabilities to forecast weather in these areas and to understand what kind of specialities we may have there. As you know, nature always have surprises for us. Another project that I'd like to mention here is called INTAROS. That's called Integrated Arctic Observing System, that has been established for understanding what kind of new observations, for example, we could do over the Arctic areas in order to get better in understanding the nature and the behavior and the phenomena of the nature, but also to how to develop services for all different types of users in the Arctic areas, and also to serve science. One area, I don't know how well you can see this image here, where we would like to put more effort on, and this is like a dream for those who are dealing with the Arctic meteorology. This is the satellite information. Satellite information is often the only way to get good coverage of the area and the situation that is ongoing in the Arctic areas. And this is illustration here represents the highly elliptic orbit satellite type of mission, where you could actually do continuous monitoring of the area by 2 or 3 satellites. But this is the kind of thing that is not ongoing at the moment. But I would like to give you a sort of something that you would remember, that this is the one of the way that we can solve a number of problems over the Arctic areas, not only when it comes to the meteorology, but also to the communications and even positioning, which all are needed in order to, for example, deliver better services over the area, but also they can connect to each other. If you have a vessel that cannot really navigate in the area, it doesn't have the global information system type of products like weather products, or if it doesn't have any communications outside the area of the vessel, then you will have something that to develop and needs to be developed in the future. So our findings so far are enlisted here. 2 months ago we had this meeting in Levi, and before that already in last August we also have a scientific networking meeting in Finland, where different scientists from Arctic countries and other countries as well joined us to understand, to give an understanding what we should do in terms of science. And this is a kind of a synthesis so far what we have found. First of all, as I said, weather is boss. This is the first thing that we have to understand. But of course, since Arctic areas are rapidly changing due to global phenomenon, the risks are changing. So we have a lot of things that we may know, but we have to explore more. So we have to be aware of things that we don't know yet. And this can be only done through international cooperation. We can't solve anything of these by ourselves, by one single country, but we have to cooperate. As I said, Arctic changes do not stay there. They affect all of us. And this is, as I said, also law of the nature. We have to take this into account. One thing that is quite clear, we have done this already before, but we want to do more, is that we need to intensify our collaboration, especially data sharing. And data sharing is something that would then bring fruits to all of us, even in a global field. We need also to strengthen our link between science and the understanding and knowledge of the indigenous people. This is something that we have to work on also from the science point of view, and this is a challenge, of course. We need to find new yet unknown innovative solutions to the known challenges. This is also so. And we need to enhance our Arctic monitoring capabilities of atmosphere, cryosphere, and oceans. If we are talking about meteorology, we often talk about only atmosphere, but it's about oceans, and it's about cryosphere, it's about water, and it's about everything basically. And we should also explore more the possibilities of satellite monitoring. This is something that is really a dream for us in the Arctic areas, and especially to take into account the possibilities that highly elliptic orbit satellites would bring. And all our efforts, of course, they should be based on sustainable solutions. We need to do this in long-term basis. But then again, there's also business opportunities. We shouldn't forget those. So business and science, there is a lot of synergy, as stated there, unlimited benefits. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for sharing the outcomes and recommendations from the program in Levi. What I think we'll do is just continue on with our speakers, and then we'll come back for questions and answers and thoughts and comments. So please.
Ambassadors, all guests, good afternoon to you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank the organizers to invite me. I had the opportunity some 10 years ago to be at the meeting here in Washington that was initiated by Senator McCain and the Norwegian and Icelandic embassies. And it's really nice to be here back again to discuss Arctic issues. And that was the topic at that time as well. I have a few hats at this meeting. I'm the Director General of the Icelandic Met Office, but I'm also reporting from this science meeting that Johanni mentioned earlier in September in Finland, where a lot of scientists from the Arctic region or studying in the Arctic came together and tried to identify the gaps, assess the present situation, and suggest some future actions. So I will also be at the second panel, but then I will talk more about how we are responding to these assessments and the gaps that we have seen. So let me start. Yeah, I should do this myself, I guess. So this is really sort of the preamble. We need to identify the threats caused by Arctic climate change. We are seeing unprecedented change in air temperature, and that is affecting sea ice, glaciers, permafrost, and hydrology. And of course, the cryosphere is very sensitive to any changes in temperature. But we are also seeing ocean acidification, and that is really a concern, especially for countries like Iceland that live very much on the ocean. And as we have heard through the discussion with the Arctic Council and its committees, traditional lifestyles is in many places in upheaval. So people are really facing very challenging changes. Just to show you the record from the Arctic, this is well over 100 years, and it shows the difference between warming in the Arctic versus the global warming. The red is the global warming, and the blue is the Arctic, and we can see much greater variability, both on the short and the long term. And in recent years, we have seen much higher increase in temperature in the Arctic than globally, but of course, they are all quite related. This is a figure from yesterday showing the anomaly of temperature in the Arctic, the bigger one. And we can see the red or brownish color is a positive anomaly. And we see an anomaly almost across the Arctic Ocean. The smaller figure shows the average for February this year. And we see a huge anomaly over the Arctic Ocean, maybe 15, 20 degrees centigrade, which is a tremendously high number. And temperature there at the pole was even above zero on the average. This is sea ice. One of the big concerns there is that the old ice is disappearing, and the color code here shows red is the old ice, 5 years or older, and that has decreased very significantly in the last few years. And these are figures from '84 on the left and since recently on the right-hand side. This is a figure of the ocean acidification, and we can see that the areas that are changing the greatest are in the North Atlantic. And there are some records that we have from Iceland, north of Iceland, and they are showing even faster change than here is shown. Now I did something wrong. Okay, it was not so complicated. Okay, but I think the science community really asks for and really focuses on understanding the role of the Arctic in the global climate system. That's really a science priority and probably one of the biggest science challenges that we have, because the system is incredibly complicated. And like Johanni said, this requires sustainable observations. This is a one-day map of observations, and you can say, well, there's plenty of observations on the meteorology over one day, but we can see the gap is in the middle, and that's really where the satellites that Johanni was discussing can fill the gap, not only to monitor the cryosphere, the sea ice, the sea surface, but not the least to monitor the atmosphere itself, which is really difficult to monitor by or measure by any other means over the polar regions. And we need, as Johanni said, we need to communicate, and we need to communicate to all levels of society, but also among ourselves within our community. We talk a lot about meteorology, but like Johanni said, we are really talking about Earth systems science here. Not only meteorology, but Earth systems science. And we need to send clear messages from this community to the public and the policymakers. And one of the initiatives by WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, are the Arctic Regional Climate Centers. And one is in implementation, and it's really 3 nodes. One is the North American, one is the Siberian, and one is the North European node. And all these groups work closely together to provide services. And one of the services is the outlook we can see for sea ice from NOAA. This is an outlook from December last year about how the June ice conditions might be. When we look at the whole scene, there are critical pieces missing. As I have said earlier, the Arctic system is providing very complex feedback to the global system, but also vice versa. Campaigns in science are needed, and of course we have had many of them, both from, actually from all the countries around the Arctic Circle, but also from many other players. I like to mention in particular Germany, which has been very active in polar research. Enhanced sustainable observations are needed, and one issue we have not really discussed is the complication of the data sets that we have. It's not only sharing of data, but also having the mechanism to share that data. Many of the big campaigns, a lot of that data is not necessarily so easily available, and that's one of the roles that the World Meteorological Organization and the Met community can help with, to share this data in a more efficient way. So these are all common challenges for all of us, and we need common solutions, and we need multiple ways of collaboration. And I think the steps under the leadership of Finland with the Arctic Council is really taking a huge step forward in this collaboration. And of course, we need to enhance the collaboration among the meteorological community in the Arctic. And that's, of course, one of the benefits if we can sustain this priority in the future within the Arctic Council. And of course, in Iceland, we are working on that. And that will make it much easier for the Arctic countries to share important meteorological information. Then, of course, we are always trying to build the bridge between science and services, and of course, services and policy should all be based on science. With this, I think, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Snorrason. And our final panelist Mr. Carvin Scott is the Director of the Alaska Region of the National Weather Service. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Carvin Scott. I'm Director of the National Weather Service Alaska Region. And I want to thank you, ambassadors, for helping to sponsor this. Dr. Farrell and I guess Ms. Goodman now has left the room. I want to thank everyone and Mike for helping me and the organization and bringing this panel together. It's really a pleasure as I've had the opportunity over the last few years to work with Arnie and Johanni. And it's as I say, you can really see the cooperation that's going on in the high latitudes, and again, it's being actually exemplified and brought out even more with under the Arctic Ministerial. What I did want to say, I guess I really appreciate Mike. I appreciate the temperature in the room. This is more like my home. I live in a little town called Girdwood, Alaska. Again, I'm going to speak to some of the folks here that are in the room, and we haven't been above 55 degrees at my house this whole year, so this makes me feel at home. So I want to really say I appreciate that. Secondly, I did want to point out, unlike most of the other Arctic countries, we hold something probably more in common with Alaska and the U.S. as with the Danes in Greenland, where the other Arctic countries, Scandinavian countries, and of course Canada, where they're connected geographically with their Arctic extent, where we are actually disassociated, so to speak. We call ourselves OCONUS as opposed to CONUS contiguous U.S. And so there is a little uniqueness, and hence those of you that detect accents, you notice it's not a Southern Alaskan accent. It's actually, as I tell my family, I am Texan by birth, but Alaskan by choice. And I've been up there 28 years as part of the Weather Service and various science and service-related activities. So again, I wanted to talk, and I wanted to really thank Johanni and thank Arnie for your presentation. I really don't need to show any slides because they've already preempted me, and because they've said everything more eloquently than I'm going to be able to say. But so it's again, I think you're going to see, and if you haven't seen with the first two slideshows, there's a lot of commonness within those of us who operate meteorological services in the high latitudes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about NOAA's role in the Arctic, because I think those of us within the U.S. know the National Weather Service is part of NOAA, and NOAA has a lot of other entities, not the least of which is operating satellites, the National Marine Fisheries, the National Ocean Service, as well as operating aircraft and operating ships, and for surveying and doing air surveys. We'll also talk a little bit about the broader cooperation in the Arctic, and also add on and talk a little bit about NOAA's support to WMO's Arctic activities, of which both Arnie and Johanni have already alluded to, and then talk about opportunities for future collaboration. And again, I wanted to apologize in advance for those of you who were expecting Dr. Uccellini, and you got me. And so it's, but he had to, again, extends his condolences and his regrets for not being able to attend, but we was preempted with another engagement. So I'll start off with NOAA's Arctic vision. And some of you that are at least familiar with NOAA should, we've got a lot of documents out there, and certainly there's the NOAA strategic plan, but then within this we have the NOAA's Arctic vision and strategy, which was updated in 2011. And again, because the Weather Service is part of NOAA, we have this cross-cutting sort of relationship where the Weather Service is supporting a lot of the activities within the Arctic, obviously, integrated, and not the least of which is supporting conservation and management of resources. Those of us that live in Alaska and live in the high latitudes, we certainly realize that Alaska is a gem. Alaska is the last great frontier within the United States. It is a national treasure, and those of us that live up there realize that and are integrated into trying to successfully manage and maintain this wonderful resource we've been given access to. And one of the things is that there's one thing to be involved in both conservation and management, but I think as both Arnie and Juhani have talked about, but also doing it and ensuring that we have a sound science that undergirds this, as opposed to developing policy maybe based on emotion or on hearsay. So this is one of the reasons that that NOAA is engaged in a lot of activities and making sure that the science, as I say, supports a lot of the policy inputs. Again, one of the things that we want to be able to do is to support the both healthy, productive, and resilient communities, of which both Arnie and Juhani have talked about. Having spent some of my time in what we call Bush, Alaska, and there's Alaska on the road system, and as I try to tell my friends here in the lower 48 and those of you who live in the Beltway, there's more paved roads within the Beltway here in the DC area than we have in the entire state of Alaska. So Alaska really starts where the roads end. And I don't have my obligatory slide that shows how huge Alaska is compared to the lower 48, as I try to embarrass my National Weather Service colleagues in the lower 48 about how large our area of responsibility is. But there's an enormous area. There's an enormous area in Alaska that is not, the only way to get there is either by boat or by airplane and not connected to the road system. And so the global implications, I think, as both of my colleagues have said, and I think Juhani said very, very eloquently, is that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. And from a meteorological perspective, that there's plenty of evidence and plenty of research out there to talk about I think as Donald Rumsfeld talked about, the unknown unknowns. And there's a lot of things that we do not understand about the physics of the atmosphere and being able to measure, and I'll call it the chaos that gets injected into our modeling systems because of our inability to measure things in an appropriate fashion, both in the lower portion of the atmosphere and even in the higher latitudes. And so by gaining and working towards, from a research and an observation perspective, of being able to measure the Arctic and be able to forecast in the Arctic better, will have, I'll say, positive influence and impacts down in the lower 48. So there are implications to what's happening in the Arctic and impacts here to the lower 48 or continental U.S. So we talk about what are the drivers for what we're doing. And within the government, those of us that are government employees, we do things based on requirements. And so we have requirements documents out there, not the least of which are the National Strategy for the Arctic, NOAA, what I've alluded to in the previous slide, the NOAA's Arctic Vision and Strategy, and the NOAA Strategic Plan. And as you can see, well, it's kind of difficult to see here, but within the NSAR, one of the goals and objectives is advance U.S. security interest in the Arctic. Within NOAA's Arctic Vision and Strategy, it's forecasting sea ice and improving weather, water forecasts. And then also within NOAA's strategic plan, we talk about the Weather Ready Nation. And if Louis were up here, I'm sure Louis would talk probably another 5 minutes on Weather Ready Nation and impact decision support services as we transform, as we evolve our organization. I think, as both Arnie and Juhani have said, it's not good enough anymore here as we approach the end of the second decade of the 21st century to merely provide weather information to people. The ubiquitous nature of cell phones and the access to the amount of weather data, what is incumbent upon us as meteorologists is to find a way to integrate the information and the added value we provide as meteorologists, as oceanographers, into the decision-making process. That is, it's extremely important for us. And again, how we're evolving our technology and evolving our science and our service delivery within the United States, and we're doing it under Weather Ready Nation. What's also not up there is there's a newly released Department of Commerce strategic plan, the Weather Act, which was recently enacted here in the last few months, as well as we're in the formative stages of our next generation of our Weather Service strategic plan. And the Arctic report card. If you'll see, there's a lot of different drivers out there about these changes that we see going on. And as we say in Alaska, that climate change is basically Alaska's where climate change meets weather. And we see a lot of weather events, high impact weather events that are exacerbated by the climate change, whether it's melting permafrost, whether it is the lack of sea ice, shore-fast sea ice. and a lot of other derivative sorts of weather and water impacts that are impacting not just the folks that live in Alaska, those of us who reside there, but as we see these emerging requirements going forward here in the next decade, as we'll see in the next presentations, we have to be ready, and we have to be to ensure that our information is accessible and integrated into the decision-making processes of folks. So this is a little kind of a vignette, a descriptor of the things that we deal with within my sphere of influence within the Alaska region. And we have and as I said, as you can see, we have a strong aviation, I'll say, program within Alaska, because that is the main way folks get around in Alaska. And it's because of the lack of roads. And it's not flying like I did yesterday on a 737 from Boston, where I was with my son, and down here to DC, most of which is in these single-engine airplanes with either skis on them, or we call these tundra tires. These are fat tires, so they can land on dirt strips, or actually they can put them on skis. This is how folks get around. And so we have a strong aviation program in Alaska. Also, we have a strong river and hydrology program, because a lot of our big rivers, the Yukon, the Kuskokwim River, 93% of the population in Alaska live along the water, either along a river in Alaska, which is where a lot of the interior Native Alaskans populated with their villages, or along the coastal areas. And so right now, actually, we're in the midst of what we call breakup. I know that those of you that are watching things in the upper Midwest, yearly, usually it's the Red River and sometimes the Missouri River, depending on the kind of a winter they have, where they actually, the river ice will break up and cause sometimes flooding or cause bad effects. This happens, and it only happens every few years, maybe in the lower 48. But in Alaska, it's a big deal. And because of the remoteness of most of our populations and the proximity of our villagers that live along these big rivers, like the Yukon, it is a tremendous issue. With the number of floods that we have, or for that, because of the large amount of ice that will back up into the villages, or for that matter, ice that gets lifted up and then it will actually scrape a village off the face of the earth, like it happened in 2012, I believe in Eagle, Alaska, where the ice literally scraped the entire village off the face of the earth. And it's interesting to note, for those of you who live in the Maryland, Virginia area, there are more river gauges in the state of Maryland than there are in the state of Alaska. So I jokingly say, this is not where you want to build your house. But it is, this is actually, I believe, in Kivlina, and this was taken several years ago. But this is what happens when a lot of the villages, especially our coastal villages along the northwest coast in the Chukchi Sea, when they built villages in this permafrost sand area in the coastal areas. And now what has happened, of course, with the the melting permafrost, and of course with the later forming shore-fast sea ice, 2 to 3 weeks later, as we've seen in the falls, and the sea ice coming out, the coastal or shore-fast sea ice melting earlier in the spring. This is making our villages more vulnerable to this coastal inundation, the coastal erosion, and coastal flooding. And this is one of the impacts of what's going on. And there's actually 31 villages in Alaska that have been identified as endangered, in terms of that we as the citizens of the United States and also the state of Alaska are going to have to determine what we do with these villagers, and it's not a cheap solution. And it's all part of ensuring that our sound science is tied to the policy making, which is really part of what we're talking about here. I won't talk. We burn. Those of you that have an interest in wildfires and forest fires, we burn more acreage in Alaska every year than they burn in the entire lower 48. Space weather is a huge issue for us in the high latitudes, not just in Alaska. When there's a coronal mass ejection or some sort of solar storm, that there's two things that can happen and that affect the ionosphere that impacts the GPS lock, and it will also with what we call ionospheric scintillation, which then affects HF communication, which is the way that you talk to aircraft, which is the way that ships talk to the shore, or ship to ship, talking with HF communication. And as we say, space weather, by and large, in Alaska, in the high latitudes, doesn't cause bad things to happen. It makes bad things, whether it's a search and rescue, whether it's a crabber. If you watch Deadliest Catch, we actually work with the folks on Deadliest Catch. Our ice desk does. But it makes a bad situation worse, where you can't communicate with a ship that's in distress, or a snow machiner that's out somewhere in a blizzard, or for that matter, they don't know exactly where they are. So I say space weather is a huge issue in the high latitudes. And of course, this is Anchorage, Alaska, and Anchorage, Alaska is the center of gravity for the state of Alaska, where almost 95% of the goods flow into Alaska through Anchorage. And of course, I'm not going to try to pronounce your volcano. I call it E14. Arnie, can you say it for me, please? Thank you very much. I'm not even going to try. I refer to it as E14 and 14 extra letters. But we actually have about 68 active volcanoes in the last 100 to 150 years in Alaska. We deal with, and because of the circulation in the northern hemisphere, of course, we deal with the volcanoes that are active on the Kamchatka Peninsula. So we're dealing continuously with volcanoes. We actually have 4 active volcanoes that are within 150 or 60 nautical miles of Anchorage, Alaska. In my 28 years up there, we've had 3 of those volcanoes go off, and it has had tremendous impact to cargo transport and to, I see Colonel in the Air Force out there, J Bear Joint Base Elmendorf, which is the center of gravity to meet the, I'll call it some of the high latitude responses to aircraft. They had to evacuate the airport for a number of days, which is our northern and western response to intrusions into our airspace. So volcanoes play a huge role in Alaska. And I won't talk too much about tsunami, but the Tsunami Warning Center for North America sits in Palmer, Alaska. And of course, fishing, huge industry in Alaska. We have most of the largest fishing ports in Alaska, and if you love king crab, then it almost certainly comes from Alaska waters in the Bering Sea. So we've already Arnie's talked about, actually exemplified, did a really good job, and I appreciate that. Some of the issues that we're facing up there, I'll call it first, and certainly in recorded history. Some of the warmest days we've had, some of the most rain, like in Fairbanks in the wintertime. The earliest, this year, for instance, it was the least amount of sea ice in the Bering Sea in what we call the satellite era, which has started in 1979. And I won't go through all of these, but what we have seen in just my short time in Alaska, we've seen transformation in and I'll call it the weather, the shorter term seasonal weather that is, and of course climate is nothing more than looking at weather over a period of years. So we see all of these things going on that we see the climate changing in very real sorts of ways. And it is tied, again, that we can't do this alone within the Weather Service, and it has become, I would say, critically important that the Arctic countries, work more closely together and coming up with a collaborative or coordinated or sort of activity. And this is alluded, as you can see, these 2 pictures down here. This is actually a part of an effort, and those of you probably in the U.S. will remember, where Shell Oil was drilling in the Chukchi Sea, just off Alaska, about 70 or so nautical miles off of the shores of the northwest coast. They drilled in 2012 and 2015, spent I believe it was $7.2 billion to drill 2 wells to find out what sort of oil and gas there were in that particular area. And they were asking us sorts of questions that we had never been asked before. In other words, and I'm talking about the Bureau of Energy, Ocean and Energy Management, who was the main regulatory folks and permitting folks that oversaw the drilling operation. They were essentially in January, wanting to know when the ice was going to go out in this Hannah Shoals area where the drilling was going to go on in or about October 1st. They wanted to know when the ice was going to come in, and then when the ice was going to go out so that they could allow ships to go in the Arctic. Nobody had ever asked us what sea ice was going to do 4 to 5 months in advance. And and it was a scientific question. When we talk about, as Arnie and Juhani had talked about, there are a lot of scientific questions that we're not prepared at this point from an observational perspective as well as a modeling perspective to really answer. 2012, it was really a learning experience for me in my role there in the Alaska region over the science and service delivery for Alaska. We were much better prepared, and when the question was asked again in 2015, because we had worked with our Climate Prediction Center to come up with an improved experimental version of what they call their climate forecast system, and which then actually had some value, and it actually gave us some insight in the predictability of sea ice and looking for the onset of sea ice in that area in the latter portion of October. Interesting to note, and again as a side note, to show you where we're at in our climate, operational climate modeling, is that experimental model was never brought into operations, and the reason it wasn't is our CFS version 2, the Climate Forecast Systems version 2, its main function is to forecast ENSO, in other words, the El Nino-La Nina cycle, which is related to drought monitoring in the western portion of the U.S. The tweaks that they made to the climate forecast system that we operationally run in what we call the experimental version that improved the sea ice forecasting broke the ENSO forecasting. So I say that not as any sort of denigrating remark, because it was we spent a lot of resources to improve our experimental CFS version 2 model, but to show you where we're at in terms of I'll call it the interdependencies in the unknown unknowns, and we've got there are a lot of gaps both in I'll say operationalizing some of the things that we need up there to ensure that decision makers have the right information in their hands at the right time. Although I will say this, this is Crystal Serenity, and I won't talk too much about it, but this is actually a great cooperation between the National Weather Service, both on the East Coast and the West Coast. Crystal Serenity took a Northwest Passage. If you had $50,000 to lay down, you too could have had a suite there on the Crystal Serenity. I didn't have that kind of money, to be perfectly honest, and so we only provided a little bit of support for the Coast Guard, but we actually work with Meteorological Services Canada and the Eastern Region of the Weather Service in the United States to help provide sort of a blanket, as it were, as they traversed and plied the waters north of Alaska out of Seward all the way to New York. And so this is only, we believe, this is only the beginning, the tip of the iceberg, as we go, so to speak, as we go forward. Let's see. Okay, and they've already talked a little bit about these broader international cooperations. I know that I believe it was Johanni talked a little bit about AMAP, the US AON. Is that it's, we're not an island up in Alaska. Obviously, we have a number of nations and a number of non-Arctic nations that have an interest in understanding what's going on in the Arctic, because as Johanni and Arnie said, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So we as members of the world community, we have I would say should be determined to better observe and to understand the dynamics and the impacts of some of the changes that are going on physically, and what are those impacts to the ecosystem. So there's a lot of different activities up there, and not the least of which protection of the marine environment, PAIM, we've already talked about AMAP, and of course the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna. And it is extremely important to remember that the ecosystem and some of the policy decisions that are made that concern what we on the NOAA side refer to as the wet side of the house, the biological side of the house. It's important that we have the best science and the best physical modeling, the best observations that undergird this, so that we are working in a cross-cutting, cooperative sort of way, and so that we're giving people that are making decisions the best information they can possibly have. And so the opportunities, again, this is under the Arctic Council's Agreement on Enhancing International Arctic Scientific Cooperation. I think that to me, the key word here is collaboration. And I'll emphasize again, to the point of hopefully not boring you, is that we cannot do this alone. The National Weather Service does not have the resources, certainly, to do this alone. If we're going to do this and we're going to do it right, is going to require the cooperation, the coordination of a number of different communities, a number of different nations out there, and to do it in sharing information. Because in the past, and I think that both Arnie and Johanni both referred to, is that there's a number of stovepipes, because especially not in the research community, that the research community tends to do things to get a specific research outcome. And on the operational side of Quite often those observations and some of those, I'll say, understandings and the results of the research don't necessarily get to us operators, or for that matter, observational platforms that are out there to provide certain research are maybe out for a year or two and then that are providing great information to those of us in our operations, but maybe they get pulled. And so, and we talked about these gaps. These gaps directly impact our ability to understand and characterize our Arctic environment from the bottom of the ocean to the top of the atmosphere. And then it certainly impacts our ability to derive forecast information out of those models. So a couple of activities that we've already talked a little bit about here. EC4s, Arnie, again, appreciate Arnie's role in EC4s and also in Global Cryosphere Watch. You can see those of us here within the U.S., we've got a couple of members. I guess we have 4 members in EC4s. I'm one of the executive members. And Arnie and Barry from Canada, are both the director and co-directors of GCW. And then again, we've already talked a little bit about the Arctic Regional Climate Centers, and I think that there's Canada actually is the lead here for the North American side. And then again, the WMO commissions on various experts that are related to climatology and atmospheric sciences. And again, to work together on topics that impact the Arctic. And I can't emphasize enough working together on these issues. Because it's, I'll say one more time, what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. So we've already talked a little bit about the WMO. We actually have two folks within NOAA involved in the steering committee. We got a couple folks actually out of the Alaska region that work for me, involved in YOP. And again, the idea is contributing to many of these data sets and these observations during these special observing periods. And it takes a lot of money, for instance, to do some of these special observing periods. For instance, to release additional upper air balloons in order to take soundings in the atmosphere. It takes on the order of about $10,000 a site per month in order to release 2 extra balloons a day over 30 days. And it's an amazing amount of money to actually do some of this, to do some of this. I'll call it the high frequency observing. But the real key, because the YOP is actually continuing over the next couple, 2 or 3 years. And so one of the things they're going to be working on is these YOP super sites, and then working on innovative technology for Arctic exploration. And then of course, this is near and dear to my heart here, and we've started this, is this sea ice drift forecast experiment. Because generally, sea ice has a huge impact, as it has for all the Arctic countries. But it in Alaska, because of the amount of coastline we have, we have the majority of the coastline in the U.S., and a lot of it is ice covered or ice bound for a large portion of the year. So, and then of course with the commerce that goes, as I point out, that it really doesn't matter which way you go into the, I'll call it the east side, the eastern hemisphere, on the Atlantic side. There's only one way to get the Pacific, and that's through the Bering Strait. And so we have a keen interest within NOAA and within the Weather Service in understanding the sea ice drift and where leads and polynyas might form. And this sort of kind of captures here the future opportunities. And you notice here that the Polar Prediction Project will feed into where this is what we see within the Weather Service is an emerging demand signal for this improved and enhanced subseasonal to seasonal forecast. And because there's questions people are wanting to know. Where do I build infrastructure? When can I take a resupply barge to Red Dog Mine, the largest zinc mine in North America? When can I get drilling equipment up to Prudhoe Bay? When is the last barge I can get out of Prudhoe Bay? When can I start taking barges along the Siberian coast, going through the Bering Strait? When is the last barge I can take through? There's all these questions they're asking that really is testing our ability in order to actually provide meaningful, actionable information, accurate information. And this is all tied together. And as you can see, it links from the tropics to the poles, and certainly into the subseasonal area from the minutes, what we call tactical weather decisions, And these all three are tied together. And the Polar Prediction Project is this unifying, I'll call this unifying effort to try to link in high impact weather to the subseasonal and seasonal activities. So this is my last slide, and this is Louis, if you're watching this is for you. No, seriously, really it does talk about what we're doing within the National Weather Service, and really it gets back to providing information that actionable information in the hands of decision makers, and what we call our deep relationship core partners, so that we want to deepen and be able to ensure that people have the right information and understand how to use that information. And then, of course, improving our science and technology. Arnie talked about big data. We're looking at predictive analytics. How do you actually get your hands around these terabytes of information that's pouring in off of satellites? How do you assimilate this information? How do you get signal from noise? It's a tremendous problem that we are going to have to do, because, again, it's not just weather, water, climate information, but that's getting this information, teasing the signal out of the noise, so that this could be fed into the policy making decisions, so that they're getting the right information, so that they're making the right decisions. And also here in engaging strategically and growing our broader enterprise, both in private industry and also in the Department of Defense side of the house. So again, that's all, and I thank you.
Thank you, Carvin. Well, to me, we spend weeks on these issues, but I wrote down just a few, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sherry for her thoughts, and then back to the panel and then for questions. But a couple of things strike me. First of all, thank you very much for taking us from FMI and the chairmanship's efforts to bring together this cooperation from an international perspective. And then the recommendations found in your latest document, which I believe is available outside, Findings of the Arctic Meteorology Summit of 2018. Make sure everyone has that as well, because it continues to help to frame the issues and a path forward. But thank you for doing that. And then, Arnie, thank you for bringing, at least in my mind, this broader context and the recommendations and discussions that have happened thus far to the circumpolar context and the complexities of that. And Carvin, thank you for taking it down, at least in, again, my mind, even though you spoke about the regional aspects of the Arctic, our Arctic Ocean, but really the impacts to a particular place in the Arctic, for instance, Alaska. So I really appreciate that layer. And I don't know if you rehearsed that or not, but I really thank you for doing that and for making it real to many of us who live it, but for also those who need to know more about it. So I'd like to turn it over now to Sherry Goodman, who's our Senior Fellow in the Polar Initiative and the Environmental Change and Security Program. I've asked Sherry to provide some insight and comments, because Sherry has been working on these issues for, I was going to say decades, but we'll just say for a mature period of time. Sherry, thank you. And perhaps we have a microphone for Sherry? Right here. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here today, and thank you both Finnish ambassadors for joining us and for helping us to give voice to the good work that you are doing in Finland and with Arctic partners to address the many challenges in the region through the work of highlighting meteorology. And I would note first, in your important document here, the very first, where do we stand? It says we need to identify the threats caused by Arctic climate change. And nothing really could be more important. We know that the Arctic is changing more rapidly than anywhere on Earth, and that this community of distinguished meteorologists from across the region and leaders is at the forefront of turning that science into observations that are useful to decision makers. And I think that is what's critically important at this current time and place that we're in, because we need not only to continue to observe, monitor, and document, but we need, most importantly, to make this real to a variety of communities. You noted, in fact, Carvin, you noted how increasing predictive capability provided what I would call sort of a risk reduction to those who are operating the Crystal Serenity. Use that as an example. So the early beginnings of the tourist industry in the Arctic now have information through your work that allows them to reduce risk sufficient to operate that vessel. But we know the risks from climate change are increasing, right? We know that climate acts as a threat multiplier for other risks in the region, but your work will help to bound that risk. And I think that's increasingly important, that you are able to show that and bring that forward to the emerging, to the growing shipping, fishing, tourism, to the security risks that we face as the geopolitics of the region are rapidly changing. And we've discussed that here at the Wilson Center, and many of you are very familiar with that. But with greater and greater access to the Arctic, there is much more opportunity to acquire its resources, but also for the risks of acquiring those resources and the increasing geopolitics that comes with that. So being able to understand those risks and bound them, I think, is increasingly important. The other I would note, and you all sort of referenced it somewhat, but I want to sort of draw you out in two areas. One is to talk further about how our increasing ability to observe and then use these observations to predict weather to climate, weather is the boss, as you said, will enable us to reduce risk in other sectors that are going to operate in the region in coming years. And second, talk about business. You all, it's very relevant here. And I know in the next panel, we're going to talk even more about the high elliptical orbiting satellites and the increasing growth of opportunities for innovation and industry sustainably, hopefully, in the region. But those opportunities are also important to elicit, to connect further the science and research, this community, with the opportunities in business in a sustainable way. So it would be very useful for you each to spend a little time sharing your observations.
Thank you, Sherry. So 2 questions. Carvin, maybe I could start with you. You could pick both or either of those questions.
Well, I think it's, I probably want to maybe it's going to actually get into I guess, the second talk. But the business aspect, being a federal employee, is that I'll use the word agnostic about the purposes. My job as a NOAA employee, and certainly as a Weather Service employee, is to ensure that my folks have the best information they can, and also are well trained enough, obviously, in order to be able to articulate that information to the decision makers. And then it's my job, really, at the I'll say at the administrator level, is to ensure that I'm linking up with those decision makers, both within the federal government, whether it is somebody like the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management who would be managing an activity, or for that matter, within private industry, and ensuring that we are cooperating and collaborating with private industry. And I'd go back to the shell drilling. Interesting note is that during that both activities, during 2012 and 2015, we actually linked up with the contractors, with Shell. And the idea here is that we did not want to be exchanging business cards if something happened, like a Deepwater Horizon. Not that it was that big of an effort comparatively, but so we actually coordinated with private industry in this case to ensure that we were on the same page from an environmental perspective in case there was a search and rescue, in case there was a hazardous material leak release, or whatever activity. And so to me, that was a sort of template that going forward is with business, because part of my mission statement, which I don't have up there, if you look at the Weather Service's mission statement, it's protection of life and property, and because we're part of the Department of Commerce, it's enhancement of the national economy. And this is really where we're going with Weather Ready Nation, with what we call Evolve NWS, is to really focus on both, and as I said, if you saw in that third bullet, is working with and to ensure that we're working with the greater private industry, and to ensure that they're getting the right information and we're integrated into their decision-making process. Because I think they both, Johanni and Arnie, both eloquently said, is that weather is the boss, whether you want to recognize it or not. And so that really is, I would say, where our emphasis, a lot of our emphasis is going to be, which you'll hear a little bit more in the second talk, is to ensure that we are linking up in a proper way, that we're not, going beyond what is outlined in what we call the Fair Weather Act here in the U.S. We're not going outside, coloring outside the lines, but we're doing it in a cooperative, collaborative way, because the weather is the boss. And certainly decisions that are made, whether it's putting in a deep water port in Nome, Alaska, whether it are, or what kind of shipping lanes are, in fact, a decision was just made yesterday about coordination between Russia and the U.S. in terms of shipping lanes through the Bering Strait, to ensure that everybody understands the scientific constraints, and both in the short term and even in the longer range, and we're all playing with the same scientific information. So I see that probably as one of the emerging things that we're going to be doing, is to, I'll say, getting out there on the not in front of the headlights, but out there very far, to ensure that we're working well with private industry in helping them make the right, using the right weather information and doing it in an appropriate way.
Thank you. Arnie?
Yes, I would like to look at both of the questions, and maybe in a more global perspective, because it's clear that the Arctic has a very serious role in the Earth's climate, and that means that actually, since weather is the boss, the weather in China or at the mid-latitude is also impacted by even short-term variability within the Arctic. So improving our understanding of the Arctic with additional observations, and it's not only meteorological, it's oceanographical, cryospheric, sea ice, etc., permafrost. That will improve our capabilities of modeling the system, and then again that will provide us with better services. As regards the business aspect, I would also like to look at this globally. And of course, the Arctic Council knows very well that there are many, many countries outside of the Arctic that are hugely interested in the Arctic for business reasons, not only for the potential of the resources there and availability of shipping lines, but also to provide the ships, etc., and the infrastructure for the future. So this linkage between better understanding of the science of the system and the business is everywhere. And that's one of the reasons that you can see that even if I've not read all the Chinese policy on the Arctic, the whole concept about their infrastructure projects is based on having the sound science to make those decisions. And they are talking about huge investments, both regarding the sea routes, but also the land routes that are related to the Arctic conditions.
Thank you. Johanni?
Thank you. Very good question. I'd like to thank for that. In the field of meteorology, I think we have like 192 members at WMO, and we have been developing this system together for quite some time. Doing it together, doing it with the research community, and so on. But now the game is changing. It's quite clear that there are different types of reasons why the paradigm is changing when it comes to the work of the meteorological organizations at any country, but also because there are a number of disruptive items that are benefiting us. For example, we have been developing this system that we have from the point of view that we need measurements, and then we make the services. And all of that we do is very much based on the solid science. But now our systems are already mature enough to be sort of connected with crowdsourcing type of observations, for example. And this gives a whole new opportunity for all of us to make totally different type of things. All of us are carrying mobile phones, for example. They are making measurements all the time. Our cars are making measurements. Well, when we go to the Arctic areas, we have all the vessels there that can serve as a sort of a, center for delivering the services to others, but also to produce them and so on. And we have new technology incoming. I think it's called edge calculations, or in the 6G generation of the mobile services that it's still incoming. That there is a lot of possibilities that we have to carefully look at and also understand that the others are doing so as well. So we have the big players, global actors like Google, we have Microsoft, we have all those working actually to the same direction. And I think that all of us, we have a vision to have better services and to make business, for example, smoother. And I think that it's quite easy to calculate, for example, how you connect the cash flow of some business to temperatures, for example. One can do that. But now again, I'm dropping all these words, nice words like artificial intelligence. If you do that together with those things, then you will probably find out something totally new. So there is a lot of things that is ongoing at the moment. I think that this crowdsourcing is one part that would bring possibilities to the Arctic areas. Another a bit similar thing, but of course much more expensive, is the fact that there is now new startup type of companies that are releasing nano and microsatellites to the area. And they may also include something that would be of benefit and add value to the things that we have done so far. We basically in our communities may have not been working with them too much in the past, but that's probably because it hadn't added value to what we do. But now it started to do so, and we have to figure out from the box how to actually have a dialogue there and how to develop these things. So I think that when it comes to, for example, business opportunities, we have to look at the whole value chains, from the observations down to the services and down to the customers, and discuss more with all these matters, and have the politicians also included in the discussions, because quite often we need them also to give them a push, or give us a push, like civil servants or so on. But then again, all this can be applied to the Arctic areas, and I think that in Arctic areas you can actually take it as a laboratory for that kind of thing, because you're still missing some of the basic things there. So this is, I think that there's a lot of things that we can do, and we are living very exciting times when it comes to the to working in the meteorological organization. So thanks for the question.
Thank you. I have a number of questions, but I'm going to hold on those. We're at about 2:30. We've got another 15 or 20 minutes or so for this session. So I'd like to open it up to those in the audience who have questions of this panel. So to my left in the back, thank you.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and this has really been very enlightening. But Carvin, opening up as far as business is concerned, this really goes to the heart of investment in the Arctic and what we don't know about the Arctic and what we're just now starting to learn. I know Michael's very much involved in that. But looking at this blending of business, governments, talked about the politics of that, also NGOs, non-government organizations, but also the indigenous peoples. How are they all going to fit into this, and what type of investment are we making, and what type of investment should we be making? Because the Arctic, as they say, is changing dramatically, and that pace is only going to accelerate. So that means the investments in all this needs to accelerate. So how do we manage all that, bring all these actors together? But again, going back, a group that's mostly forgotten, the indigenous, because they are there on the ground and really can share so much into all of this with the technologies and the wisdom of traditional societies. And thank you for being here.
Thank you for the question, and I know we'll explore a lot of these very, very good points in the next panel. So if I might just take the moderator's prerogative here, I really like the idea of teasing out this idea of the indigenous peoples component in the larger global discussion, and then within not just the WMO, but in your specific work in this particular effort. So maybe you can start off, and then we'll just go down the list here.
Yes. Okay. Well, this is this is not an easy task, and I think that as I said, for example, within the WMO, we have these 192 different countries basically. They all have their different legislation and different type of how do you say, coutume perhaps, I don't know if that's an English word, how to deal with matters between the government sector and the business sector and so on. But I think that we need especially dialogue where all these parties are together solving how we need to change the rules in order to make it possible to make investments to these areas, because quite traditionally they have been governmental investments, and I think that for example the infrastructure, when we are talking about the measurements of the weather, they are like part of the governmental infrastructure. They are like roads. And today, if you are building a road or an airport or a harbor, you would need to put weather information also there. So it's like a digitalizationing of this thing. And this is quite clear there. But when we go to the next step, I think that we need to discuss with our lawmakers and with the businesses to find these solutions. And they may not be same in every country, but we may find, common nominators in a way. But this is something that we have to do together, and I think I really liked how Carvin, you put it, that we can't solve these alone. We have to do cooperation, even in this area that you mentioned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oni?
Actually, I think the experience of the Arctic Council in general is very basic to this issue. They have dealt with this for probably since the beginning, and I think they have really established a very good mechanism to deal with many of these issues, and I think that's where the meteorological community, will benefit tremendously for much closer collaboration with the Arctic Council.
So perhaps as the chairmanship enters its second year, there's more collaboration and overlap with the Arctic Council's permanent participants and other like organizations. A flow of information, but also guidance and influence.
Absolutely, and the guidance that we have in Iceland, actually, and the focus is very much on the work of the Arctic Council, on the risk assessment, on the resilience, etc., and often on the local and regional level, and that's where this communication with the local people is quite well developed. But that's where they need better prognosis, better forecasts, higher resolution models to help them with their work. And I think that's how we will engage with these communities. Because in general, the operational agencies might not necessarily have done so, except as observers for some of the measurement stations, etc., etc. So I think we look very much to that experience.
Thank you. Carvin?
Yeah, that's a really hard question, and I'm glad I didn't get Johanni took it first, and so there was actually two questions within the question, and I think about traditional environmental knowledge and indigenous populations in Alaska specifically. That's actually kind of gets into the second presentation I'm going to talk a little bit about, because I've got a real passion for indigenous populations and Native Alaskans. And we are, as part of our transformation within National Weather Service, Evolve in Alaska, we're going to try to meet that demand in a way that we haven't been able to do in the past, because I could tell maybe I'll tell a short side story. We used to have a really good friend that worked when I was in the Anchorage Forecast Office as a science officer many years ago, and he was Aleut. And he used to tell me a story about when he's now retired, when he was 16 years old, out on St. Paul Island and out hunting for seals at the edge of the sea ice, and with his cousin and his uncle. And he talked about they'd get out into the fog, which happens at the edge of the sea ice, and he had no idea where he was at. He had no idea where he was going, and he talked to his uncle, and his uncle knew where they were going, and to cut to the chase, he talked about their different words in Anungan, which is Aleut language, and the different words for fog in Anungan. And they have to do with the character of the sea ice, how the sea ice is related to the water, which way the wind is blowing, which way the clouds are going. And from that he was able to navigate with really basically nothing more than a compass, and then also to get to the ice leads, and then to get the seals, and to get the seals back to that little spot of land that's called St. Paul Island. And so I took that story many years ago and I took it to heart, and as I see our role within NOAA. If we're really going to get down and I'll say answer some of the and get engaged with the Native Alaskans, which is and the indigenous population, subsistence hunting, that we're going to have to understand do things in a little bit different way, because as a meteorologist, we have 2 or 3 words for fog. You know, we have advection fog, radiation fog, precipitation fog, things like this. It's more about the physical causes, not the actual impacts. But from an Aleut that's out on the sea ice, that's hunting for seals, they're talking about the impacts, and it's related to the physical environment. So I looked at that as basically a case of how we're going to have this next generation, what we're going to have to do within the Weather Service in order to make ourselves, to provide actionable information in a culturally relevant way to the Aleuts. And as we all know, if you know anything about Alaska, Alaska is not an amorphous Alaska natives. You know, Haida and Tlinkits and Athabascans and Aleuts and Yupik speakers, as well as Inuits, and then there's a variety of in between. So we have a big challenge within NOAA, so that we're not looked at as throwing information over the transom and in English to make it actionable in the culturally relevant way, but then also to engage and understand what the meaning, as you said, the wisdom in traditional environmental knowledge, which is really difficult in my mind, is we talk about predictive analytics and big data. How do you take objective meteorological information, sea surface temperature, salinity, pH levels, things that we deal with and we're used to predicting. How do you then translate that into something that's culturally relevant? So it's a great, to me, that's actually one of my passions as director, and we're going to be moving towards in the next few years. I think both Arnie and Juhani have talked about the business side. It's a little more difficult in the National Weather Service because of the relationship between private industry. And my goal, and I think Louis up here, he would articulate it even better, is that we want to engage with our private partners that are involved in environmental forecasting to help them do their job better. I think it's a really good euphemism. There was an old commercial, I believe it was 3M, talked about we don't do airplanes, we do airplanes better, help make airplanes better. What I want to do as the director of the National Weather Service Alaska region is not to do somebody's job, but help them do their job better and to engage with private industry so that we can partner together and to enhance the national economy. So,
great, thank you. I'll open up to another question here on my left, and then we'll go over to this side to my right.
Thank you. I'm Egils Milbergs, ambassador. I'm co-founder of a nonprofit in Seattle, Pure Blue, that deals with water entrepreneurs. I'd like to sharpen your insights about innovation opportunities, how we can accelerate innovation. Imagine if we could offer a $1 million X Prize for an innovation that would help make your work, the data, and the whole value chain down to decision-making more valuable and more impactful. I'd like you to hypothesize such an X Prize and offer what that challenge would be to the entrepreneurs in the world.
So how would you take a new Arctic X Prize?
Well, that's again a challenging question. Maybe you could.
There's $1 million on the table, and you're going to pass it.
Okay, yeah, but let me put it this way: that I tend to believe to the younger generations. So I mean, millennia generation, or what they called. I think that they have a tendency and a capability to think out from the box. So. We need innovation. This is quite clear. But how to deal with it? In Europe, for example, we don't have open data policies as for example you have had here in US for a long time, and this is an area where I think that new innovation can be born. Where, for example, the public sector information is given to the young innovative minds think about it. So I think that it's more like how to actually phrase the question itself. What do we need? We need in the Arctic. We need new innovations in terms of making observations, for example, or how to deal with them or deliver them to one place to another, or how to get them in real time to the tactical needs or so on. So this is a complicated thing, but I think that the kind of way to make the data available and ask for out from the box, innovations. I know that I didn't actually answer the question. Sorry.
Maybe two quick responses, then we'll try to get one more question in. But
I
I have a
actually-
feeling that there's going to be an overlap between this panel and the second panel, and we might come up with some X-Prize winners here.
Thank you for the question. I was at the AGU not too long ago, and someone offered $7 million to find really a breakthrough solution for bathymetry of the oceans. And I think that is really something that would be very beneficial, because the cost of operating in the Arctic is astronomical, and anything that is automated there by innovation is going to be helpful. Thank you.
Carvin, quick response.
A quick response. $1 million. That's, if I will keep it really short and say predictive analytics. And to you, I hate to use the word artificial intelligence. To me, that has sort of negative connotation. But if you look at the explosion of data we have quickly exceeded our capability to get our arms around the data, to be able to integrate the data. When I came into meteorology 35 years ago, I mean, you could get your arms around data sets, and the modeling was very simple, and it was the forecast process was relatively simple. Now we're into petabytes of information, terabytes rolling in on a daily basis. How do you get the signal out of the noise and put that signal into actionable information into the hands of a consumer that's out there with a 1G network? And that to me, in Alaska and certainly in the Arctic, there's a lot of folks like that. And that to me, if I was going to put a prize, it'd be predictive analytics that's taking big data and so that one could ask a question. Again, I'll call it magic hands. Ask a question that you could go and hyperslice and then using predictive analytics, and then to extract information in an automated sort of way to help them in decision, whatever the decision might be.
It's a fascinating question, and something I think many of us in here would like to follow up with you about, because I think it's not just about $1 million for an Arctic solution, but there's a bigger.
Yeah.
We'll take half now and then half later, but I think that there's a lot of discussion points here about that, because in my mind, listening to you over the last hour or so, I'm thinking that that elephant is big, and so you have to take the pieces of it. And what I'm digesting is the fact that there are many organizations, a lot of individuals, a lot of people working on all of these common challenges, just understanding this environment, and then what are the impacts of the change, and then how do you work through all that. But really, what are the priorities? And those are hard to set. And then how do you fund them? And what makes it even more complicated is how do you fund them, work on it, come up with solution sets, communicate to the public what that might be, how policymakers can use the solutions.
Prioritize.
And then prioritize them, but also get agreement with all the different nations about the Arctic in our particular case. So thinking through that, and that might be a piece of a follow-up. I see that we're at about 15 minutes to 3 or so. We're going to have a very short break. The next panel will come up with John Farrell as moderator for that panel. You'll see a lot of overlap between the two. We'll look at solutions. We started that discussion here just a bit. Please join me in thanking this fantastic panel.